arrived, are you getting the story? I'm Michelle Lavander, Director of the USC Center for Health Journalism. Thanks for joining us today. In this webinar, we'll explore the implications of a green wave that is sweeping the nation. The cannabis industry is witnessing explosive growth, with sales projected to rise from 10 billion to 80 billion over the next decade alone. The growth is fueled in part by the huge interest in the potential therapeutic benefits of cannabis products. Yet big questions remain about the potential health benefits and risks, with little research available to guide doctors and policymakers. There also are a multitude of questions on the policy and regulatory front, as an increasing number of states now allow medical marijuana. Nearly all Democratic presidential candidates have embraced legalization, yet the drug remains a controlled substance under federal law. This creates conditions for what could become a looming conflict between states and the federal government. All this represents an unprecedented opportunity for in-depth local and national coverage. With this webinar, we'll help provide a roadmap to reporting that objectively explores health benefits and risks, as well as the policy challenges posed by this booming industry. Here to help us decipher the implications of these fast-moving developments and to help you find ways to tell stories, we have three distinguished experts. Dr. Ziva Cooper is the Research Director of the UCLA Cannabis Research Initiative. Her research involves understanding the therapeutic potential and adverse effects of cannabis and cannabinoids. She serves on numerous boards and committees on this issue, including the National Academies of Science Committee on the Health Effects of Cannabis. Paul Demko is the new cannabis editor at Politico Pro, a veteran health reporter. Previously, he spent 4 years on Politico's healthcare team, primarily covering the insurance industry. He also was a 2018 National Fellow with our Center for Health Journalism when he took an in-depth look at 3 states pursuing divergent paths under the Affordable Care Act. We'll also hear from Allison Martin and Nushin Rashidian, the co-founders of Cannabis Wire, which covers the global billion-dollar cannabis industry. They also co-authored the book, A New Leaf, The End of Cannabis Prohibition. This webinar is offered thanks to the generous support of the National Institute for Healthcare Management Foundation and the Commonwealth Fund. You can tweet about the webinar at the hashtag #CannabisNews. A word about our format today. We'll be hearing from our panelists first, and then we'll turn it over to you, our audience, for questions. Because we have several hundred people on the call, we'll ask you to write your questions into the control panel of GoToWebinar. You can write us there if you're experiencing technical problems as well. We will be archiving this webinar at centerforhealthjournalism.org. Now, let's turn to our speakers. Paul, as we get underway, why don't you set the stage for us when it comes to the cannabis industry?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Michelle. Really excited to do this. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. I'm going to give kind of an overview of where we are right now in 2019 in terms of the cannabis industry. As Michelle mentioned, it's a roughly $10 billion industry right now, with projections that could reach 80 billion by the end of the decade. So this is just a rapidly growing space. And what makes it so fascinating is the tensions that are between the federal government and state governments, and all the different ways that plays out. Makes for just fascinating stories, whether it's banking issues or medical research or whatnot. So just to start with, we now have 33 states around the country that have some form of either medical or recreational use. And that includes 11 states that have enacted full legalization. The most recent was Illinois, and that was notable because Illinois became the first state in the country to enact full legalization through the legislature rather than through a ballot referendum. And, you know, there was a lot of thought at the beginning of the year that other states, particularly New York and New Jersey, would also go down that path. But what we found during the most recent during this year is that these issues can get really thorny when legislatures dig into them, particularly some of the issues around economic and social justice raised by criminal penalties and the war on drugs. Those really bog down some of the efforts in other state legislatures. But Illinois is one that a lot of people will be watching because they did take a pretty comprehensive approach at legalization and have tried to address some of those social justice concerns. So that will be interesting to watch. The other thing going on in Illinois right now is you have municipalities deciding whether or not they want to allow cannabis businesses. So you're having a lot of community meetings and discussions about that right now. Here's a map that you can see sort of the lay of the land. I got this from the National Conference of State Legislatures. The dark green there is the states that have full legalization. The lighter green is the medical marijuana markets. And then the lightest green is states that just have a low THC program. And then you still have 4 states that don't have any form of legalization whatsoever. A couple notable things on the full legalization states. You do have a couple of outliers there, and that's Vermont and the District of Columbia that have full legalization but don't allow sales at this point in time. So those are slightly different circumstances there than in those other states that have embraced full legalization. And one of the reasons you've seen this rapid growth across the country in terms of legal markets is because it really is reflecting a change in public opinion. And it's changed really pretty dramatically in a short period of time. I was talking to former Representative Barney Frank, who spent a long time and was a powerful figure in Congress, and he compared it to the gay marriage movement and changing perceptions around that. But if you go back about 2 decades ago, and this is polling data from Gallup, you can see if you look at about 2000, support for legalization was at 31%, and that's now at 66%. So that's just a dramatic change, and state policies are reflecting that change. And another indication of how much potential growth and money there is in this industry is that you're seeing a lot of companies that have not traditionally been cannabis companies eyeing this space because they see an opportunity or a threat. So you have like Constellation Brands, which most of you would know as a company that makes Corona and Modelo, purchased a $4 billion stake in the Canadian cannabis company, Canopy Growth. Similarly, you have Altria Tobacco Company. The tobacco market has been steadily declining over decades now, and so they see an opportunity here to invest in a space that is growing. So they put $1.8 billion into another Canadian cannabis company, Cronos Group, and then you have a lot of sort of ancillary businesses that are increasingly finding themselves in the cannabis industry, whether they really want it to be or not. And the interesting example of that is really Scott's Miracle-Gro, which anybody who's tried to grow a garden is probably familiar with. And Scott's has seen a huge jump in their hydroponics business. I think it now accounts for about 25% of their revenues and is growing by double digits annually. And a lot of that is driven by cannabis cultivation. And they have made a bunch of acquisitions to further that growth. And they've also been, quite active in Washington in lobbying on issues around this area as well. And I think we had a piece this week by one of our financial services reporters and one of our cannabis reporters, looking at the role that companies like Scott's played in helping to get cannabis banking legislation passed in the House earlier this month, I believe, or last month. It might be last month at this point. It all blurs together. So in another indication of that, this is a graphic from our data point team, and it looks at the number of entities that that mentioned either cannabis or marijuana in their lobbying disclosure filings. And you can see that it's been just a dramatic increase. If you look at, let's go back to say the start of 2018, so not that long ago. We're only talking about, a year and a half or so ago. You've seen basically the number of entities double. Now that can be, some of those are cannabis specific companies, or some of those could be like healthcare organizations like the American Medical Association. So their, cannabis or marijuana is a tiny piece of their lobbying agenda, but you're just seeing more and more organizations who are active in this area. And in addition, that's changing. You're seeing that reflected in the lobbying business in Washington, where you're seeing some of the sort of traditional K Street powerhouses getting into this. Groups like BGR Group and Smith Free Group and some others that see an opportunity here, or maybe have clients like Scott that suddenly find themselves needing to be concerned about cannabis issues. And then I mentioned the safe banking legislation. Essentially, what this bill would do is say that banks can do business with cannabis companies without fear of federal punishment. And that's been a big challenge for this industry. It's just very difficult to access banking because this is still a federally illegal substance, and banks are worried about getting into trouble with the federal government. So you've seen a situation where companies, if they can access banking, there's probably only one option or limited options in their state, and they're probably paying really high fees to get access to banking. And it's also raised concerns about access to capital. If companies can't, get loans to help grow their businesses, then it really limits business opportunities to folks who have access to a decent amount of wealth and can fund their operations. And this is another data point slide. You can see the vote in the House. It was last month, and it was just overwhelming. It's the first standalone marijuana bill to be on the House floor ever, and it passed, 321 to 103. And even, I think, supporters were a little. I had talked to a lobbyist that morning who thought they were looking at maybe 315 votes. So that even exceeded the expectations of supporters of this banking legislation. And notably, you have 91 Republicans as part of that group. So nearly a majority of Republicans, I think it's about 45%, voted for this. That would have been unheard of even a couple of years ago. But as you've seen, the number of legal markets expand, you see lawmakers responding to that. You have states that aren't necessarily deep blue states now, like Michigan, for example, that have embraced legalization, and you start to see lawmakers reflect that because it becomes an important issue for their constituents. And then I just wanted to take a quick moment to look ahead to 2020 and what might be on the horizon. You're definitely going to have a bunch more legalization ballot initiatives. Florida and Arizona are two that there are active campaigns to get recreational or adult use sales on the ballot for 2020, and industry is really behind those. I think MedMen is sort of leading the drive in Florida, and Harvest Health, both big multi-state cannabis companies, I think is kind of leading the charge in Arizona. Other states, depending on how things shake out, that you could see include Ohio, New Jersey, and Montana. And then you'll also see some medical initiatives next year. Nebraska is one that's very likely. Mississippi, another one that will be interesting to watch, especially given that it's in a very conservative state in the South. Idaho and South Dakota, a couple other options. And then I mentioned earlier that a lot of states sort of floundered at passing legalization bills this year, but I don't think that will stop the states trying to take another stab at it. New Mexico is one I think you'll probably see early next year looking at an effort to pass legislation, because you have total Democratic control, and the governor has been in favor of it. And I think Maryland, New York, and Connecticut are others that are on the list. So I think that's about it for me. I'm going to turn it over, turn it back to Michelle, and look forward to hearing everyone's questions.
Thank you so much, Paul. It's really helpful. We're going to turn next to Dr. Ziva Cooper, who is probably one of the more expert people in the country on this topic right now. Dr. Cooper, what do we know and not know about cannabis and its health benefits?
Great, thanks so much for having me today on this exciting panel. And today I'm going to be talking about a general overview about what we know about the potential therapeutic effects as well as adverse effects of cannabis. And as mentioned before, I was a committee member on the National Academies of Sciences committee that put together a consensus report related to these outcomes, and I'll be referring to that publication in 2017 with some additions because, of course, there's been literature since then demonstrating potential therapeutic effects as well as adverse effects. So most of my studies are funded through the NIH, but in addition to those, I have received some consulting fees as well as receiving funds for research from Insys Therapeutics. So as Paul elegantly described earlier, massive sweeping changes have been occurring across the United States, where only 4 states do not have any type of legal regulation for cannabis or cannabis types of products. And people are given hope every day that cannabis and cannabinoids can be used to treat severe intractable diseases and symptoms, including cancer, serious pediatric epilepsy disorders, Alzheimer's and dementia, and of course the opioid crisis. We're seeing almost weekly reports related to the potential for cannabis to help decrease our reliance on opioids and help to solve the opioid epidemic. So before we talk about the outcomes and what we know, what is cannabis? And many of you already know this. Cannabis has over 110 unique chemicals, of which we know the most about tetrahydrocannabinol, which is usually called THC. And THC is the primary intoxicating component of cannabis. And we also know the most about its therapeutic effects relative to the other cannabinoids that are in the cannabis plant. There's been a surge of interest related to cannabidiol for its wellness and health benefits, in part because there is some interesting preclinical findings, so findings in the animal laboratory, and also because it's not intoxicating and it does not produce cognitive decrements like THC does. So with respect to its clinical utility, it has great promise because it seems like there are minimal adverse effects. In addition to these cannabinoids, there are also other chemicals called terpenes and flavonoids that are thought to also have various therapeutic effects. So we know that the cannabis that's available in the illicit market as well as in dispensaries have increased in strength over time. Here's a depiction of how between the years of 1995 and 2013, there was a 3-fold increase in THC concentration in cannabis from seized cannabis. And there was recently a publication that showed that as of 2017, there was a further increase. So on average, black market cannabis has THC averaging about 16% THC. So It's important to note that when you go into cannabis dispensaries, of course, you can get cannabis with THC up to about 30%. We're seeing cannabis that is significantly stronger relative to what we've seen in previous decades. We also have these emerging trends of use. So in addition to the joint and the blunt and the bong, which have been used for decades, we're now seeing increase in vaporized cannabis, both plant as well as extracts and oils. We're also seeing a surge in edibles. We have artisanal products for the Mediterranean palate. You can get THC infused baklava. And I think most concerning with respect to public health outcomes, we're starting to see these super high potency products called dabs, wax, or shatter that have over 90% THC in it. So this is pretty much pure THC. In addition to these trends related to products that are now being available, we're also starting to see that the demographics of users are beginning to shift. We're seeing that a lot of products are being really targeted towards women, women of all ages with respect to health and wellness, as well as for adult use. And we're seeing that there's been almost a doubling of cannabis use among pregnant women. Among the older population, this is the fastest growing group of cannabis initiates. And you can see that there's been several-fold increase in cannabis use of groups that are 55 and older over the last 10 years. Interestingly, I think a lot of people hypothesize that with increased access and availability to cannabis, we are going to start seeing increases in adolescent use. And the good news is that we haven't actually seen this. Repeatedly, epidemiological findings have demonstrated that rates of cannabis use have pretty much remained steady among high schoolers. Of course, with the exception of vaping cannabis, there's been about a 50% increase over the last year among high schoolers with respect to vaping cannabis. So with changing policy and public perception, and we have these emerging cannabis products and shifting use patterns, there's clearly an urgent need to know both the positive and negative health effects of cannabis exposure. So is cannabis an effective therapeutic? And we discussed this in the National Academies Committee, and we looked at the 20 most popular indications for which people can receive cannabis across the states. And what we found is that there is substantial evidence related to the utility of cannabis and cannabinoids to help chronic pain. There were about 40 rigorous studies. When I say rigorous, these are double-blind, placebo-controlled studies. 31 of these studies were with non-cannabis plant product, and only 9 of them were with cannabis plant product. 0 of these studies were with dispensary products that are available for people to use. And all of these studies looked at cannabis or cannabinoids as an adjunct to current medication. So we have not yet seen a placebo double-blind controlled study looking at cannabis or cannabinoids alone to help treat chronic pain. And I think this is really important for people to understand. We also now know that there is substantial evidence supporting the utility of cannabis and cannabinoids for these other conditions. Of note, epilepsy, severe pediatric epilepsy disorders, with the FDA approving Cannabidiol for certain pediatric seizure disorders in 2018. The point I want to drive home is that most studies were not done with cannabis. They were done with synthetic cannabinoids, such as synthetic THC called Marinol, or another one called Nabilone, as well as Sativex or Epidiolex. Now, these are cannabis-derived products that have either THC and CBD, as in the case with Sativex, or just CBD alone, as in the case of Epidiolex. So data are overwhelmingly from non-cannabis plant products. We don't know anything when we talk about double-blind placebo-controlled studies. We have not seen any of those studies with the products that are available in dispensaries, and it is clear that legislation and popular belief are outpacing science. So frequently, we hear a lot about the potential therapeutic effects of cannabis and cannabinoids, but we're starting to hear less and less about the potential adverse effects. So I just want to cover some of what we do know related to the risks associated with cannabis use. So we know that cannabis use, smoking cannabis, is associated with frequent bronchitis, increased risk of motor vehicle crashes, impaired learning, memory, and attention, which is especially important when we're thinking about the adolescent and elderly population. We know that mother smoking cannabis or using cannabis during pregnancy is associated with low birth weight, preterm birth, and NICU admissions for the neonate. We know that cannabis is also associated with dizziness and falls in older populations, and that there are important drug-drug interactions that physicians should be mindful of, especially in populations like the elderly or those that are dealing with diseases and severe symptoms. These physicians should be mindful of drug-drug interactions with respect to THC and cannabidiol and ongoing medications. We also know there are mental health risks associated with cannabis, including schizophrenia, psychosis, depressive disorders. Most recently, we've seen evidence for associations between cannabis and suicidal ideation, anxiety disorder, and of course, cannabis use disorder. And I want to be clear that for these mental health disorders, for the most part, these are associations. Right now, we just know that cannabis use are associated with these mental health outcomes, except for one important mental health outcome, and that's cannabis use disorder. We know that this is a causal effect. You cannot develop cannabis use disorder unless you actually use cannabis. So this is a causal effect. And we know that there are certain risk factors for developing cannabis use disorder, including frequency of use. So the more you use, the more likely you are to develop cannabis use disorder. And the younger you initiate cannabis use, the more likely you are to develop cannabis use disorder. So what is cannabis use disorder? It's a host of symptoms, one of which is withdrawal. So when you abstain from using cannabis, you develop hallmark withdrawal symptoms, and this happens in a subset of users, and it's thought that this withdrawal contributes to relapse. And this is an issue because currently there are no FDA-approved medications to help people that want to stop using cannabis. So we don't really have a pharmacological agent to help give people treatment if they do want to abstain from using cannabis. So given the sheer number and popularity of people who are using cannabis, so about 50% of the population, 20% of lifetime users will meet criteria for some cannabis use disorder. And about 1/5 of these people will develop symptoms that are symptomatically severe, and half of them are not functioning in any major role at work. So cannabis use disorder is not rare simply by virtue of the fact that so many people use cannabis, and also it can be quite severe. And I think that not very many people are aware of cannabis use disorder as being a negative effect of cannabis use. So to summarize, we have increased availability in diverse products. We have different demographic subgroups who are starting to use cannabis for different reasons, either for medical use and sometimes for personal use. We don't yet understand the outcomes related to use among these specific demographic subgroups. We also don't understand the outcomes related to some of these emerging products. We know that there is some therapeutic benefit related to cannabis and cannabinoids, but we have to learn more every single day. We are not nearly up to the speed of the policy or up to people's perception of the therapeutic utility of cannabinoids. And we also know that there are certain adverse effects. And again, we're going to be learning more as more products hit the market and more people start using these products. So to summarize, there are a lot of unknowns. Here at UCLA, we're trying to tackle some of these unknowns related to both the therapeutic as well as the negative consequences of cannabis use. So thank you very much for your time. And just a call to action, these are significant times for cannabis and cannabinoid research. And I think that as scientists, educators, and journalists, it is really, it's imperative that we communicate to the public the knowns, the unknowns, and the potential hazards. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cooper. We're going to turn now to Allison and Nushin. You've both offered an important voice for raising the bar and more rigor in reporting about cannabis. Tell us about that.
Yes, hi, this is Allison Martin. I'm pleased to be here with everyone today. We are the co-founders of Cannabis Wire. We each have about a decade on the beat. I've got a bit of a technical issue here.
Yeah, how do I? Sorry about that.
No problem at all. It happens. Yeah, and hopefully this guide will help provide, some useful tips to make sure that the quality increases along with the quantity of coverage. So on today's agenda, we're going to talk about how cannabis is an intersectional beat. We're going to talk about a little bit about the landscape today, although the other panelists have also gotten into that. And we'll talk a little bit about ethics, best practices, and why language matters a little bit more on this beat than some other beats, and then maybe some story ideas to get started in your newsroom. All right, so yeah, obviously editors are realizing the value of covering cannabis, which is a growing industry. It's really obviously coast to coast at this point, and there are a lot of stories just about everywhere you can look. So yeah, as I mentioned, it's an intersectional beat. There are local stories, national stories, international stories. So locally, one of the stories that we're seeing in many states after legalization passes is something called local control, where local jurisdictions decide not in my backyard, and they'll ban sales and those sorts of things. Nationally, as Paul mentioned, we are seeing an uptick in lobbying, but we're also seeing a lot of areas where state and federal dissonance persists. And those are kind of areas where journalists can frack for interesting story ideas. Internationally, we're seeing a lot of interesting research coming out of Israel. We're seeing more and more interest in Colombia. Mexico is going to legalize soon. A lot of international stories on the beat right now. It's a criminal justice story also with expungement efforts, for example. Politics, obviously, health, as Dr. Cooper just mentioned, science, many stories on the science beat right now as it pertains to cannabis. It's definitely a big ag story. Cannabis Wire covers cannabis as a big ag story, definitely a business story. And on the tech side, interestingly, this cannabis is definitely becoming a little bit of a Silicon Valley story as well. We've covered some of this, so I won't spend too much time, but there are obviously different types of laws. You've got decriminalization, or decrim, which removes penalties associated with cannabis possession. You have different types of medical cannabis laws. Some states have sales regimes, whereas others don't really have robust sales regimes. We have CBD only laws, smoke-free medical cannabis laws, like here in New York. And then, adult use laws, or also known as recreational cannabis laws, though, as has been mentioned, in states like Vermont and in the District of Columbia, you've got legalization passage, but no sales yet, though coming soon. So in 2019, looking ahead, here are some, pretty typical stories that you can watch and find some interesting angles on. You've got ballots and bills coming. So the midterms and presidential elections are probably the most interesting times to be covering initiatives on the cannabis beat for obvious reasons. More voters are turning up at the polls, so the initiatives stand a better chance of passage. Interestingly, Arizona is going to take another swing in 2020. I'm sort of skeptical that it's going to pass. Arizona was the only state of 9 that put forth initiatives to voters in 2016 that actually failed. And there's some really interesting things going on in Arizona right now, and some interesting pushback, and also a dual effort for legalization as well. You've got some bills coming to pass in 2020. I think we'll probably see at least 4 states really making a run at legalization. In the Northeast, New York and Connecticut, the governors are likely going to plan their legalization efforts at the same time. Cuomo and New York Governor Andrew Cuomo and Connecticut Governor Ned Lamont are working together on legalization initiatives and also vaping rules, kind of trying to create a Northeast effort. And then we'll probably see, obviously, Pennsylvania and New Jersey, perhaps Florida. We'll see how these things shake out. We'll also see markets going live, looking at Illinois. A lot of eyes will be on Illinois also regarding their equity efforts. Illinois so far is seen as the state that has done the best job with equity provisions so far. So I'll talk a little bit about some lessons that we've learned at Cannabis Wire after a decade on the beat. So one is the importance of terminology. One is managing the unknowns and mitigating hype. The cannabis beat is a really interesting one. Like many beats, business owners and startup founders do a very good job of hyping their product or their service. It's obviously up to journalists to ask, you know, the age-old, hey, does it work? And really getting under the hood and asking skeptical questions. There are also some interesting ethical questions on the cannabis beat, which we will get into. So this is like kind of a perennial question on the cannabis beat. Do you call it marijuana? Do you call it cannabis? Do you call it weed, ganja, any number of pot? You know, I'm sure editors love pot, especially print editors, given that it takes up less space in headlines. We decided a long time ago to go with cannabis because it was the most accurate. It's what scientists use. You know, marijuana does have racist origins, but we find that it's also clarifying when it comes to hemp. Because hemp does fall under the umbrella of cannabis. You know, if you're trying to differentiate the two, you can say, you know, it's higher THC cousin or that sort of thing. Marijuana is more SEO friendly, so if you're aiming for clicks, you know, that's also one reason that some journalists and editors choose to use marijuana, at least in a head or a deck. So here are some common words that you'll see come up pretty much right off the bat, as Dr. Cooper mentioned. Cannabidiol, CBD. You know, if you're headed to Brooklyn, I'm sure you'll see a CBD latte cafe pretty quickly, probably next to a turmeric cafe. Cannabinoid, these are the components within cannabis like THC, CBG, endocannabinoid, and the endocannabinoid system. So the endocannabinoid system is the system of receptors throughout the body that receive cannabinoids. THC, and then, you know, other cannabinoids are becoming increasingly more common. So we'll talk briefly about some terms that you're going to hear probably right off the bat after a legalization effort passes. Cultivator, also known as a grower. These are also licensed entities typically. A processor, you know, a person who takes flower and turns it into a product. A dispensary or a retail shop. You know, testing labs, these are the entities that test for things like pesticides, molds, mildews, and also, you know, percentage of THC and that sort of thing. Seed to sale tracking, these are the tracking systems that monitor cannabis from seed to sale, like the name says. Moratoriums, you'll obviously hear that when you've got your NIMBY types that decide to ban sales. And a patient. So a patient is somebody who's typically registered with a state to access medical cannabis. There are some tricky areas. So technically organic certification doesn't really exist yet because cannabis remains federally illegal. That's obviously changing for hemp, which is federally legal after the 2018 Farm Bill passed. And you know, one thing that really has gotten under my skin over the years is that, you know, when journalists will say, you know, so-and-so was prescribed medical cannabis. It's not a prescription yet for most forms of medical cannabis. It's a recommendation provided by a doctor protected under the First Amendment. You obviously could be prescribed Epidiolex, for example, though, which is a CBD preparation from a company called GW Pharmaceuticals. So we talk a little bit, oh, sorry, let me toss it over to Nisheen here.
Great. I want to pick up where Allison left off on the kind of startup coverage. Obviously, there's a kind of age-old question, which is, you know, if all of these companies are technically bad actors under the eyes of federal government, when you're a journalist and you're seeing a pitch, you're hearing about a new entity or a new product, you know, how do you identify who's a good actor if technically everyone's illegal? And so one tip that we try to follow is we try to say that if you look at a state regulated entity or a licensed entity, you're probably on track. But it's really important, when you, especially, everyone's been reading Bad Blood, but when we see entities like Theranos, which they weren't, they essentially did not have a real meaningful product and got tons of money and then tons of coverage, this sort of thing could quite easily happen in the cannabis world. So be skeptical, like Allison said, ask, does it work, as you kind of get flooded with press releases, which will happen the moment you do a cannabis story. So the cannabis beat brings up some interesting ethical issues. So Unlike other beats, you may have impaired subjects, and your boss may ask if you've consumed cannabis, or you may need to purchase cannabis for a testing store, which has actually happened a lot during the vaping crisis. Some news organizations have gone out and actually purchased these vapes to test them. And so these are all, these are new issues that have arisen as cannabis has become legal, and you kind of need to have open discussions in your newsroom, talk to your editors, and especially on the purchasing front, that's kind of a newsroom by newsroom decision. Some newsrooms don't care if you've consumed cannabis, others do. And then as far as impaired subjects, follow the same rules you would do if the subject was drunk, really. And so I want to dive now into actually how to think about the storytelling on this beat. And there are a lot of different angles and kind of ways as you kind of start thinking of story ideas that you can kind of come at this. So one thing is that there will be a lot of stories at the intersection, or let's say where state and federal law collide. So one thing, as Allison said, there's a kind of a slew, about a dozen types of stories that come out anytime a state passes a law, where people start asking the same questions, which is, how do we know what stone driving is? We don't have a national standard for stone driving. This is definitely very much, up in the air. And so that becomes a pretty common question. What do we do about cannabis on campus? Well, odds are that the campus in your state isn't going to allow cannabis because they receive some sort of federal funding. What do we do about banking? What do we do about tribal lands? Obviously, sovereign lands. So anywhere where state and federal law are in disagreement, you're probably going to see some tension. There have been a lot of stories about gun rights, because basically under the eyes of the federal government, you're the user of an illicit substance if you use cannabis, even if you're a licensed patient or in an adult use state. And so you actually are a danger with a firearm. So another place to think about is if you're at in a state where they're just starting to talk about medical or adult use cannabis, it's a great time to figure out, who's at the table, who's funding it, why, who wants what, because the interests that are involved are going to have a big role, especially if there's money involved, a big role in shaping a lot of things around, let's say, local control, how many milligrams of THC can be in any given product. And a little bit more. So know the supply chain. So, cannabis is like any other product, right? There are people at the growing, there are people who are in charge of processing, there are people who are in charge of testing, there are people in charge of packaging and advertising and so on and so forth. So you need to get a sense of who are the people involved at each stage of the supply chain. Know the stakeholders, right? There are people who are in charge of regulating the cannabis. There are people in charge of giving out the licenses. There are people in charge of crafting recommendations for change in the law. It's important to really, really drill down and know, who has a voice in how this industry is taking shape. Here, follow the money. Absolutely, there's a lot of money here, like Paul said, and the money is going up, and the money is now coming from big tobacco, big alcohol. So, know who's spending and how they're spending to be heard. And finally, expect the unexpected. This is a growing industry. While there's a lot of money flying around all over the world, it's definitely a baby industry. It's an infant industry. It's, we had the very first sales in Colorado in 2014. And so it's really been 5 years. It's not a very long time for what's become a multi-billion-dollar global industry. And I want to go into some specific examples, just as, for the journalists and, the journalists in the audience, as you think about what kind of stories can I tell on this beat. These are stories that we've done over the past year at Cannabis Wire since we've been live. So this first one here, Cannabis Goes to Washington. So we tracked all the money kind of flowing out of the industry and, toward Congress. And we noticed essentially that as, once the Republicans took power, that the shape of cannabis legislation that these industry groups are pushing for suddenly was a lot more, GOP friendly. There's a reason why we're talking about banking and states' rights, and that those are the top pieces of cannabis legislation out there, and not so much, let's say, the Marijuana Justice Act or so on and so forth, right? It's like, how do you get Republicans on board with legalization? Well, you speak their language. And so this story kind of followed that parallel path. This one over here on the right is we noticed a rise in smokable hemp, and both kind of stopped and scratched our heads and said, wait a minute, we knew that hemp just got legalized, but we thought this was being legalized as a crop for industrial purposes, and people are rolling it up and smoking it like tobacco. What does this mean? And so we decided to dive into that a little bit, and we still don't actually know the health implications of smokable hemp, but it's out there, and these products are being sold on Amazon. And here on the left, we have this one was a pretty long piece, about 5,000 words, this is a story of failed regulation. This is about Oregon. Oregon is sort of the poster child for what happens when you don't kind of do things right out the gate, and it's a bit of a cautionary tale. And there are a lot of, not a lot, but there are several other states now that are worth examination. Oklahoma is one of them, where they seem to have no sort of cap on the number of licenses that can be awarded, and we still have yet to see the implications of that. I'm going to speed up. I know we're running out of time. And then this one on the right is pretty self-explanatory. It's more of a political story. We had 3 legalization-related announcements in one day, not too long ago. Okay, so in short, cannabis is a beat, yes, but cannabis is a beat of many beats: the criminal justice, you've got politics, you've got ag, as Allison was saying. We've got a whole kind of patchwork that's legal, and we have a business patchwork. How you do business in one state or what's legal in one state is not how it, how it works in another. And frankly, this is actually a global patchwork, which makes import-export and these other things that you would do in any other trade very complicated. And also terminology matters. It gets confusing. Sometimes when somebody says, if you read a story from another country and they say cannabis, odds are they're talking about hemp, but an American will see that and say, oh, they're talking about marijuana, and they're not. And so it's really important to really nail what you're saying, what exactly you're talking about. When people say medical cannabis, well, are they talking about, as Ziva said, Epidiolex, something you can get at a pharmacy, or are they talking about something you get at a dispensary? There are many unknowns. Again, ask questions and embrace the unknowns. Don't fall for hype. There are a lot of wild claims flying around in this industry, and that's what they are, wild claims. There are a lot of new ethical questions up for debate, and so this is new territory for journalists. This is new territory for regulators. This is new territory for all of us, and so this should be a very open and very transparent discussion around the decisions that people are making and why they're making them, newsrooms or out. I want to just flag that local newsrooms in particular have been doing some of the best work on this, because this is happening in their backyard. And so, check out their work. And also, finally, this is only the beginning. This is the beginning of the industry. There's a lot of great work to be done. And we hope that you will keep in touch. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to Allison and Nushin. We're going to open this up now to all of you. Some of you have been sending us your questions. We're also opening the mics of Dr. Cooper and Paul so that they can participate and answer your questions. As I mentioned, just send your questions to the control panel of GoToWebinar. We're going to start out with a question from Charles Dunlap. And by the way, I think, Paul, you might have a little background noise there, but Charles Dunlap, how do you... I'm sorry, what, Paul?
Sorry.
Oh, so the first question here is from Charles Dunlap. He says, how do you look at the financial aspects of medical marijuana? It's a cash-only business, and banks are having to take what is essentially laundered money from dispensaries because of depositing rules. And that was, anyone can answer that, Paul or Nushin or Allison. And all your mics are open right now.
Could you
can jump in. This is Paul.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, I mean, that's, one of the biggest challenges with this business is that is finding banking services. I think most companies will tell you that they can find some kind of banking services out there, but it's a very small number of banks, often community banks and credit unions, that are willing to do business with cannabis companies, and they hold all the cards in a lot of ways. They can charge high fees and really set the rules. So like in Maryland, I believe there's just one bank that will do business with cannabis companies, and so they can say when you're going to deposit your money and how much they're going to charge you for an account. So it's a big challenge.
Great. And as a reporter, Paul, how would you track that? I think that's what Charles was trying to get at with his question.
How would you track?
Like how big the industry is in your community, or who is the leading player, those kind of things.
Well, I think Allison and Nushin jump in, but I mean, I think that would be more like following the licensing process and figuring out who has the medical or recreational licenses, dispensary licenses, cultivation licenses, et cetera. I think that's the best way to really keep tabs who the big players are in your community.
Yeah, this is Nushin. I'll jump in. I agree with what Paul just said. Look at the license holders. For example, in Nevada, the governor did a basically what he called a transparency push, which he kind of did a data dump of all the license holders. And actually, when you went through and you kind of actually looked at all the different LLCs and kind of did the math, you realize that actually Nevada's industry is really run by like a handful of big multinational companies. In Colorado, when you look at the money in politics, you had a company there called Medicine Man that essentially was all but threatening that if the legislature didn't essentially pass a bill that would open the state up to outside investment, that they would take their business elsewhere. I mean, it was a real strong arming that happened there. That's a pretty significant threat to make, and there wasn't one clearly that the state ignored, considering cannabis brings in a lot of tax revenue for Colorado, and this was a pretty big player. So so look at the money and look at the license holders.
We have a question from Scott Enright, who asks for the panelists to address the recent vape crisis.
I wonder if that should be Dr. Cooper.
Okay, yeah, I'm happy to address this. Obviously, it's on people's minds, and unfortunately, at this point, we don't really have very much information except for what the CDC is finding, and that is that it seems like, although I'm hearing conflicting reports, it seems like the majority of cases are related to illicit market THC products. There are some cases that have been associated with nicotine vape products, but the overwhelming majority are related to THC products. And what's interesting is that, and what should be known to the public, is that it's not the THC that we think is the culprit. It seems to be these additives that are put into these products that have been found in many of the cases that are associated with these illnesses. It's interesting because California has been one of the hardest hit states, and we know that California has a legal market, but we also know that it has a very active illicit market as well. However, I heard that in some other states, these cases were associated with products that were obtained from the legal market. So, right now there are a lot of unknowns. I haven't heard of any cases that were associated with vaporizing plant product. These all seem to be associated with vape cartridges.
I'll chime in on one aspect of this too. This is Allison with Cannabis Wire. This is an area where I think, journalists and editors really need to be on the same page and need to be careful about highlighting the unknowns. I came across a Time headline on September 27th, and it says, quote, CDC says for first time that THC could be behind vaping deaths and illnesses. And then once that headline was modified, it was CDC says for the first time that some THC products could be behind vaping deaths and illnesses. In the first headline, it sort of makes it seem like THC is behind this all. So that's an area where I think, journalists and editors both need to be on their toes.
Thank you. We have a question from Pauline Cunningham. She says, my newsroom doesn't have a budget to buy marijuana projects, even for a story as important as consumer safety testing and lab result variations. Are there any foundations out there that are funding journalism projects like these?
That's a great question. Not that I know of, but you might be able to work with a lab and sort of see if there's a way that you could write a story on some of their lab testing results, do something with a specific batch or something like that.
Yeah, this is Nushin. I haven't seen, I mean, things may change now. I think that a lot of, I would argue that a lot of journalism foundations, especially when Alice and I got started on this, back in 2011 or so, it's just they wouldn't even go near cannabis. I think that especially after the vaping issue, and that being sort of a national story, and I would argue probably the first kind of really public national sort of crisis that cannabis and/or cannabis products have come up against. Potentially, again, we don't know totally what the culprit is, though they're saying it's probably cannabis products. I would say that foundations may be more open, but I can't name which ones specifically are funding this kind of work.
Yeah, this is Paul. No resources come to mind for me either, but I think I would reiterate what Allison said, that, potentially partnering with a lab that is doing testing in this area, trying to find that resource would be a good way to go.
And this is Michelle here, just to add that we've seen a lot of examples of newsrooms entering into really creative partnerships. And if there's a lab or a research institute, university, and you offer to provide, joint credit for the work, that could be a way to both bring attention to your reporting and that organization that could benefit both. We have a lot of questions here about addiction, and I'm going to try and, for Dr. Cooper, maybe sum up a couple of them. You had talked about cannabis use disorder. Let me just read you a couple of the questions we're getting, and maybe you can try and answer, a number of these. So one question was, with cannabis use for chronic illnesses, what research has been done on addiction? Similarly, for the layperson, if someone can go through withdrawal, if they try to stop using marijuana, does that mean they can actually be addicted? The popular belief is that you can't get addicted to cannabis. And then the third related one from somebody is, are dispensary owners being held responsible for identifying and cutting off patrons that are under the influence, similar to bartenders cutting off inebriated drinkers? And I can repeat some of these too, Dr. Cooper, if you're losing the strand of all these, but they're all kind of similar, so I thought I would group them together.
Great, thanks so much. These are really important questions, and I'll definitely address the first two, and maybe the other speakers can address the third. The first question, if I recall correctly, relates to incidence of cannabis use disorder among people that are using cannabis and cannabinoids therapeutically. Am I remembering correctly?
Right, for chronic illness, and
right.
So are those people at risk of addiction?
Right, and so that's a really important question to ask, and there hasn't been very much data related to risks of developing cannabis use disorder among patients that are using this for medical benefit. There was a recent report that showed that about 25%, if I recall correctly, in Canada, 25% of medical cannabis patients exhibited one symptom of the 11 of cannabis use disorder. I think that's something something that we have to think about is how do we think about a cannabis use disorder within the context of people that are using it purely for medical purposes, and weighing the risk to benefit ratio. And of course, this depends on the severity of the disease and also the efficacy of cannabis and cannabinoids to actually help that specific disease or symptom of interest. And the idea generally is if we are treating cannabis and cannabinoids as potential therapeutics, we want to create strategies to mitigate the adverse effects. These adverse effects include intoxication, cognitive effects that could be detrimental to just everyday living and, carrying out, duties and quality of life, to developing cannabis use disorder. So we want to figure out strategies to mitigate the negative effects and potentially maximize the therapeutic effects. And I think as we move forward and there are more trials looking at cannabis and cannabinoids for several therapeutic indications, we're going to see that different strategies will emerge to be able to decrease the intoxication, decrease abuse liability, decrease cognitive decrements, and be able to really boost the therapeutic effects. And what's interesting is that with the studies that were done for pain that used whole plant cannabis, the scientists that did those studies actually employed very low strength cannabis. So we're talking about cannabis with THC percentage ranging from 1% to 9%. And they found effectiveness for those relatively low strength cannabis products, cannabis plant products. That's very different than, of course, what we see in the medical cannabis dispensary, where there is offerings up to 30% THC cannabis. So this is something that we have to be acutely aware of. And I believe the second question was related to the fact that a lot of people aren't aware that withdrawal or dependence actually occurs with repeated cannabis exposure. And as I stated in my presentation, this is one of those neglected issues that we know. We have done controlled placebo-controlled studies, and we have demonstrated in the laboratory that withdrawal does exist, it is reliable, and it is clinically meaningful. And what's important is that withdrawal, those controlled studies were actually done with, again, very low strength cannabis, so the cannabis that we can get from the farm in Mississippi. We don't yet know what withdrawal is like when people are using these very high strength products. One would hypothesize that withdrawal would be greater in magnitude and much more severe. And so this is definitely an area that we have to be paying attention to, because consumers also, they might not be aware that if they are abstaining or, they go on vacation and they aren't using, they're, using cannabis daily and they abstain for a couple of days and all of a sudden they come down with these symptoms, they might not understand why it's happening. So it's very important that this message get across to consumers.
And then the third question, which you had asked, maybe some of the other panels might want to answer, was about whether dispensary employees are being held responsible for identifying and cutting off patrons that are under the influence, similar to bartenders cutting off inebriated drinkers.
Right. Yeah, so I'm not aware of that, although I imagine, now in Los Angeles where they have cannabis cafes, this is going to be a real issue. But some of the other speakers are more knowledgeable.
Yeah, I did some reporting a couple of years ago on the pilot program in Denver having to do with cannabis cafes. And I think cafes are where you're going to see, or, public consumption spaces are where you're going to see more of an effort and, training to identify similarly to bartenders might. And I've heard from bud tenders before, the people who are, helping people select products, that they do look out for some forms of intoxication, but I don't think people are really seeing much of it yet outside of those public consumption spaces.
We have a question from Emily Kopp, who says, are there public resources, databases, or documents I can use to verify whether a company is following state regulations?
This is Nushin. So in a state like California, which I would argue is kind of leading the way on this, I believe there's a piece of legislation, I actually need to now check if it passed, I think it was in this latest batch, sort of arguing that that certain jurisdictions would have to kind of post information about violations and the like, make that kind of information readily available. I know that California makes licensee information readily available in a way that in other states you have to dig for it. There's unfortunately It's really in how much information you can get from any given state about who's a license holder there and what and who and even the names of people involved it's all over the place, and it's often inadequate. And so this is definitely an area that for journalists that is kind of a bit of an issue, because it's actually with most other businesses it's not that hard to find out where the company is located, who's behind it, whether it's been cited in any way, and those sorts of formalities just don't seem to exist yet in any kind of uniform way for cannabis. So it is very much state by state, and in some states you got to really lean on the freedom of information, unfortunately.
We have a question from Fatima Navarrete, who says, has the state of California regulated warning labels of cannabis products regarding cannabis use during pregnancy and lactation?
So I can also jump in on this. Ziva actually would probably know more than I would, but I think that Dr. Cooper, I would say that warning labels around pregnancy is probably one of the most uniform and kind of the first thing that comes up when cannabis is legalized especially for adult use. That's generally, pregnancy warnings are kind of like the first thing to come up on packaging. But I will go ahead and defer to Dr. Cooper on what's going on over in California, because I know there's a lot of different jurisdiction regulation there.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm not sure about what the standard warnings are on cannabis products. I deal with only federally legal cannabis, so I don't frequent dispensaries. I know that in Canada they have this as a warning, but I'm not sure in Los Angeles. I should say that I just recently moved to Los Angeles, so I'm not totally up to date on the rules and regulations.
When it comes to state legal cannabis, warning labels are almost universally somehow communicating to keep it out of the hands of children, and child-proof and child-safe packaging and that sort of thing. And what we're seeing more of most recently, even the last couple of days, are warning labels having to do with vaping. So in Washington State, for example, the LCB just created a warning label having to do with, or a warning signage having to do with vaporizing.
I have another regulatory question. Given the lack of the most rigorous sort of study about marijuana use, how do we know the adverse effects? Is there any sort of reporting pathway like there is for pharmaceutical drugs?
I think that each state is trying to collect data related to the adverse effects, especially with respect to motor vehicle crashes. There are national surveys that collect data related to some of these adverse effects. And those surveys also provide us an indication of who is actually using cannabis and how how the demographics of users are shifting over time. I do believe that Canada has a pharmacovigilance program where they're actually able to track the adverse effects of medical cannabis and cannabinoid users over time. The other speakers may also know about other sources of these data.
This is Nushin here. I'm not familiar with anything beyond what Dr. Cooper has laid out, but I will say I don't know if there are any regulators on the line, but I will say do look to Canada on their data collection front. I want to double down on what Dr. Cooper said. They have some of the most robust government data I've seen on consumer prices. It's like it is a transparency heaven up there. So I would hope that we would see a little bit more of that here stateside.
And for our final question, this one comes from Miranda Mazariegos, who asks, the associations that you talked about related to mental health, were those in the short or long term in terms of effects after long-term use?
So that's an important question, and I didn't really want to get into the weeds too much related to the strength of the association with respect to frequency of use and duration of use, because some difficulty about this literature is that there isn't a uniform way of defining cannabis use, heavy use, moderate use, infrequent use. It's hard to say whether it's acute or long-term use. And another important thing to remember is the age of the user. So are we talking about, emerging adults? So a lot of these associations have been observed in emerging adults, but not necessarily adults. So these are really important variables to keep in mind when disseminating the information to the audience.
Great. I want to thank all of our panelists as well as our audience for this really lively discussion. I see that there are a number of other questions that have come through, but unfortunately, we have run out of time. But of course, we'll be archiving this webinar, and it will be available later today. And you may want to follow up by looking at the work of all of the folks featured here. Just a quick word that we will shortly be sending you a survey about this webinar and your ideas for future ones. Please fill it out, as it really helps us a great deal. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.